All right, good morning to everyone. Thank you as always for taking the time to be with us this morning, even with daylight savings time over the weekend. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Today we're going to hear from Dr. Ann Kokas, who is professor at the University of Virginia, and she has a talk titled How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. Her talk is based on a recent book of the same on the same topic, but of a different title. Her book is titled Trafficking Data, How China is Winning the Battle for Digital Sovereignty. So a little bit of a riff on that. It came out from Oxford University Press in October 2022. So that is the foundation for this talk, but also there's been some recent developments in this space, which she is going to cover for us this morning. For those who are familiar with the CGSR lecture series, you'll know that we've had a number of speakers dating back to last summer on this topic of US-China technology competition. And all of those talks are on the CGSR website under our lecture series tab. And this lab's mission focus area on integrated deterrence and technology competition looks at all of these aspects of technology competition. But today we're going to look at sort of one very specific important aspect of this competition, and that is this focus on data and on data exploitation. And so we're very fortunate to have Ann here to speak with us today on the topic. So let me say a little bit about her. She is the C.K. Yen Professor at the Miller Center, a Professor of Media Studies at the University of Virginia, and the Director of the University of Virginia East Asia Center. Her research examines US-China media and technology relations. She's written the award-winning book, which I just mentioned, that argues that the exploitative Silicon Valley data governance practices help China build infrastructures for global control. Her award-winning first book, Hollywood Made in China, which came out from the University of California Press in 2017, argues that Chinese investment and regulations have transformed the US commercial media industry. We've had a lot of people actually cite that book, Hollywood Made in China, at our workshops on US-China competition, so good to see that in the resume. She's also a non-resident scholar at Rice University's Baker Institute of Public Policy. She's a life member at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a fellow at the National Committee on US-China Relations Public Intellectuals Program. She's received a number of distinguished fellowships, and she's written in a number of very distinguished places. So a fantastic speaker and a fantastic topic. The ground rules, she's going to deliver her remarks for 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we'll open the floor for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically. Please submit your questions to me in the chat function and get those in as soon as you have a question or would like to get into the conversation when the conversation concludes. And that way I can get the discussion rolling as soon as she finishes her remarks. So, Ann, thank you again for being with us today. I'm very excited to hear the talk. I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to put the link to your book here in the chat so people can check that out as you're starting your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you for hosting me here today. It's a real pleasure to be here talking about this topic that has just gotten a little bit of it's much more lively over this past week with action in Congress and discussions from the Biden administration about signing a potential bill related to the banning of TikTok. So I'll be talking about a lot of conceptual frameworks related to these issues, but I welcome the chance to also talk about the implications of recent policy activities in this area. All right. So today I'll be using my book Trafficking Data as a foundation for our larger discussion about US-China data security relations. This book actually emerged out of my first book, Hollywood Made in China, though it may not seem immediately obvious how it did. And essentially what happened was I was working on Hollywood Made in China, or essentially the dissertation that became that book, while I was a Fulbright scholar in Shanghai in 2009, and my internet kept cutting out. And Michael and I were just talking about the irony of doing work on the tech sector when you don't have a reliable connection. And so in some ways, this was actually the foundation of this book. I had some neighbors across the street who were foreign investors running a virtual private network or proxy server company in Shanghai at that time, which was shockingly in 2009, a legal business that they were running. And I had the opportunity of working with them in their offices so that I could have reliable internet access. And what ultimately happened was I was writing my dissertation on China and Hollywood while they were working on these issues related to data protection and digital sovereignty. And so what happened was, as I was writing Hollywood Made in China, I was trying to decide if I should include the case of Netflix in my research. And ultimately, it wasn't clear to me whether or not that should be part of the book, Netflix's efforts to enter the Chinese market. And thankfully, when I was talking with my colleagues at VP Ninja, this proxy server company, about this issue, they made the point that the issues that Netflix was facing entering the Chinese market were radically different than the issues that a company like Disney was facing when trying to enter the Chinese market because of the data that they were trying to gather about Chinese nationals. And this was in 2009, so it was prior to the 2010 internet white paper on the internet in China, which established a lot of the foundational digital sovereignty frameworks that we see, or cyber sovereignty frameworks that we see in a Chinese context. But really kind of moved my research in a different direction, where I bracketed off the entertainment content, the non-networked entertainment content from the networked entertainment content, and began looking from that perspective. Now, initially, this book was focused entirely on entertainment, and you can see that in chapters that look at social media and social media entertainment, as well as gaming and gaming platforms. However, one of the things that became clear as I was doing my research was the kind of wide range of different networked data-driven platforms that were attempting to operate between the US and China. Now, a little bit on scoping, and I think especially in a room full of researchers, this is important to talk about research methods. Initially, this project was going to be focused much more on both US efforts to enter the Chinese market and Chinese efforts to enter the US market. But I also wrote this book primarily during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so as a result, it's much more focused on Chinese market entry efforts in the US, or almost exclusively focused on Chinese market entry efforts in the US, rather than as much of a focus on US market entry efforts in China. Now, there is the benefit in the sense that US market entry efforts in China have been a lot less successful in a lot of different, in these particular industries. We've also seen a significant pullback from a lot of US tech firms that are investing in the Chinese market. But I wanted to be sure to flag this because I think this is a really important area of research that still needs a lot of work. It's increasingly difficult to do this type of work for people who are trying to get visas and do field work in China. It's also increasingly difficult for, so I'm working with some postdocs now who are trying to do work in this area and are Chinese nationals, but they also face the challenges of concerns about their family and the kind of implications of how their work might be perceived vis-a-vis their citizenship. And then there's the other category of naturalized Chinese citizens, so naturalized to the US or Canada, which is an even more complicated area for identity and doing research in this area. So I think this is one space where I'm really interested to hear from the other researchers in this room about the different ways that you are approaching navigating, doing research in this area based on questions of access to China, because I think this is a very live issue in our field. So the outline of the book and the kind of larger arguments that I'm making in this project, as well as in the new project that I'm working on, which focuses on third countries and how they are impacted by US-China data competition. So Korea, Japan, Australia, Singapore, India, is that US regulatory fragmentation, Silicon Valley's data lust, and Wall Street's addiction to growth have fueled the growth of China's digital realm. So essentially what the argument of the book is not so much that China has taken this expansive kind of global approach to cyber sovereignty, though it has, but that the lack of regulation within a US context, and when I say the lack of regulation, I mean lack of systemic national regulation that applies to all companies and exists beyond the duration of an executive order, enables the Chinese government to be much more successful in these efforts to expand China's digital realm in a kind of entrepreneurial policy way. Now, I think this is really important to note, particularly given the discussions of the TikTok ban and the forced divestment of TikTok. If you read the book, you'll see them, very critical of efforts to limit data gathering by TikTok in a U.S. context. And I'm happy to talk about, further research that I've done in that area and some of the weaknesses that I see there. But the key point here is that just forcing the divestment or attempting to force the divestment or banning one particular platform is really not the pathway to a more sane and carefully regulated U.S. digital ecosystem. And to be frank, one of the key challenges here is that there's not a nationwide policy on things like data privacy that actually allow for enforcement that exists at a pace that's much faster or much more capacious than efforts to focus on, one or two particularly prominent companies. And if you read the book, which I hope you do, I talk about a wide range of other platforms that also have large numbers of users in the US that are also gathering large amounts of user data that don't receive nearly the same amount of scrutiny that TikTok is receiving. And I think that this is actually a really significant problem, particularly when we're looking at things like companies that gather user bio data. The other significant challenge we see here is, the Biden administration has been moving forward to try to limit data sales through data brokers through the executive order process. But again, this has this same kind of challenge of not having an expansive and continuous impact on the US digital economy. And this is a key difference that we see in the US and Chinese contexts, where within a Chinese context, we do see very expansive laws and policies that do not have the same fixed duration that things like executive orders have. And I think this is a key point, and one that where it's really important to continue to highlight these issues of duration and expansiveness to policymakers. That being said, one of the biggest challenges is that within a congressional context, there are a lot of different types of pressures and stakeholders and financial interests associated with why members of Congress may or may not want to act more expansively on regulating the U.S. digital economy. So before I dig into this, one thing that I think is always important to highlight when talking about China and the tech sector, and I'm sure that this probably resonates a lot with people in this lab, and I know that it resonates with us at UVA, is one of the challenges of talking about the Chinese tech sector and about surveillance is that there's often a conflation of Chinese government policies and the challenges presented by those policies, which again, I argue are amplified by lack of clear continuous policymaking in a U.S. context, and how we contend with the ways in which that attracts unfair and discriminatory attention to immigrant and Asian scientists in the U.S. And so, as I was writing this book, there was the increase in anti-Asian hate. We also saw the Department of Justice China Initiative, which thankfully has now been closed, but that draws extensive scrutiny onto individuals who are working within a U.S. context. And so one of the things that I really want to highlight here is the importance of focusing on the interaction of Chinese laws and policies and U.S. laws and policies as being central to moving forward these policy debates and moving away from and actually eschewing any focus on individuals, because frankly, it's much more effective to actually design a system in a US context that protects the data of users in the US and doesn't focus on kind of individual circumstances. Now, this isn't to say that there are no cases of this, but also it can also be highly exaggerated. So, for example, one of the challenges that I've encountered in talking with a lot of Chinese friends who do work on similar areas in China is this the conflation of their work with their relationship with the Chinese government. I mean, here I am, for example, talking to a US government entity, and I don't work for the US government. In fact, I never have. I was a Fulbright scholar, but I have never been employed by the US government. But in similar contexts, Chinese scholars could be viewed as, working for the US government or the Chinese government if they were giving a talk at a government lab or agency. And again, I don't want to establish false equivalencies here, and I'm happy to talk about the nuances between US academia and Chinese academia. But I think one thing that's really important is for us as researchers to really very carefully disaggregate individuals from these larger claims. And one of the tools that I use in the book is this idea of gridlock, a term that was developed by Pardis Madhavi, who is Iranian American and was writing about Iranian women's issues in a US context, and found a lot of her work was being mobilized as a way to critique the Iranian regime, which in ways that she wasn't necessarily comfortable with. And again, I have a lot of criticisms for what's going on in China, but one of the things that I think is really important to note is that within a US context, when talking about these issues, they can be mobilized in ways that aren't necessarily productive for the future of US-China relations, for US tech relations, or for large parts of the American population. And I think it's something that's really important for us to be very mindful of. So the key concept of the book is this idea of data trafficking, which is an extractive process that exploits corporate data to share with third parties with limited user consent or acknowledgement to gain government control. And so essentially this is this idea that when moving user data to a Chinese context, the Chinese government has a wide range of different tools that they can deploy to be able to access user data. Everything from the Personal Information Protection Law to the Hong Kong National Security Law to the Data Security Law offer different mechanisms to the practice of military civil fusion, offer different mechanisms for the Chinese government to access user data through private companies. And so one of the things that I argue is that even efforts like Project Texas and its relation to TikTok present significant challenges here because of the different ways in which companies are able to share data internally, and because of the wide-reaching and very ill-defined mechanisms through which the Chinese government can pressure firms to gather user data about them. The challenge of doing research in this area is while I was able to speak with firms that were forced to share their user data with the Chinese government, for the most part, the people who were sharing that information only did so off the record, and they did so only when they were really mad or when something had gone horribly awry. So there are a lot of cases where this information is not disclosed because it's part of normal business practices, and companies for whom it's working actually have very little incentive to talk to someone like me. So within the context of the book, I also talk about this idea of data and how we can think about different metaphors for data as we're moving forward. This becomes also really, I think, interesting when we're talking about issues of AI and what data gathering within a world of AI infrastructure means. But data is often, and in 2005 there was this, the fad of calling data the new oil, which is this idea of an extractive process, something that is in some ways value neutral but resource intensive and is able to supply and be monetized. But one of the things that we've been seeing is that in addition to this new oil or this extractive resource, we can also see that user data is functioning as infrastructure for underlying systems, specifically for machine learning and for artificial intelligence efforts. But also one of the things that I thought was really interesting when I was doing research on my book was the ways in which data is used, user data is used as an asset to generate return. One of the pieces of information that I found most fascinating when I was doing research on this book is that user data can be used as both collateral and a liquidatable resource in bankruptcy proceedings. So when signing terms of service, however opaque they are, an individual user is not just making an agreement on the terms of service for that individual with that company, but also with any of their future creditors should that company go bankrupt. So this might not be an issue if you're making a deal with Google, but it might be an issue if are really love to find new apps that might not be super well funded or might not actually last for a long period of time. They can actually sell your data as part of bankruptcy proceedings. The other thing that I think is increasingly important is the way in which our personal user data ultimately functions as a way to map our humanity. So there's, with the upcoming election, there's been a huge emphasis on the ways in which user data can be used to deploy synthetic video, synthetic images, synthetic voice, and this is only becoming more and more prominent. In the book, I also talk about this idea of trafficking. So when we're thinking about data trafficking, and I draw on three different ways of thinking about the word trafficking. So the first is drug trafficking. So thinking about this mobile, multi-layered system of trade that exists on the margins of legality, where there are some legal mechanisms and some illegal mechanisms and a lot of gray market mechanisms to engage in this trade, where it's so potentially enriching that there are a lot of reasons not to fully crack down on the market. And there's a high amount of dependence among people who are clients of this industry. So when we think about the tech sector and we think about social media, we can think about the number of people who talk about needing to go through detox or their addiction, or the fact that individuals are users, just like within the drug trade. There's also this idea of human trafficking, so the exploitation of the body, the body and labor through this non-consensual labor bargain, where very few people understand that when they're on social media for recreation or when they're using a lot of digital platforms for example, verify their identity or to use different services, they're actually also performing labor for that company by supplying images, by supplying voice, by supplying video, etc., as well as different information about human behavior. And then ultimately, there's this idea of data traffic, or the movement of user data that platforms use to build more sophisticated algorithms to document engagement, and this also offers a chance to better monetize services. Ultimately, this is part of network effects and risk-based decision making, where in a US context, and this is one of the things that's really interesting about seeing the TikTok discussions associated with the divestment or ban of the app. The US uses a risk-based decision making model, which essentially allows for regulation in many cases only after a problem has occurred. And the challenges with something like data trafficking is once large amounts of user data move, it's not like they're going to be recovered. So one of the examples that I use in my book is the case of Grindr, which was acquired by a Chinese firm, and the data that was generated by Grindr, a lot of very sensitive data, was moved to China and was stored in China for several years. And then there was a forced divestment. The Department of Commerce forced the divestment of Grindr by its Chinese parent company. But at that point, all the user data about the individuals who were using Grindr, including very sensitive things like HIV status or nude pics, intimate conversations, had all been moved to Chinese servers. And so as a result, while there was this effort to move things forward and to limit data trafficking, by the time it actually happened, because of this risk-based decision-making approach, in some ways it didn't even matter, or it only mattered for future Grindr users, not previous Grindr users. And so this creates a really significant challenge because as platforms become more powerful, they incorporate more users. As they have more users, they become more appealing. As they develop this superior product offering or the perception of a superior product offering, they're better able to optimize ads or algorithms, which allows for more third-party interest, and so on, increasing data collection on users. Now, these network effects of more populous networks becoming more valuable create a really significant challenge in the regulatory landscape, as we're seeing right now with TikTok actually asking its users to reach out to their congresspeople across a wide range of different districts to complain about the potential ban of TikTok. And I think one thing that gets lost here is that it's not an outright ban. It's just an outright ban should ByteDance be unwilling to divest it. And this, I think, if ByteDance is unwilling to divest it, really is in some ways a smoking gun of the potential risks that TikTok does present. And in previous discussions about the potential divestment of TikTok, the Chinese government actually designated TikTok's algorithm as a national security asset, which is something I also talk about in the book. So the likelihood of an actual divestment in this case, I think, is extremely low. But one of the things that gets lost in a lot of the discussion about the TikTok ban is that there is actually a choice that the company can make so that TikTok can continue to operate. But it doesn't appear that that is the tack that they're trying to take right now with their users. So a lot of these issues, I think it's important to note, are the result of the structure of the US tech ecosystem, where the tech sector has outpaced government regulation and oversight, in many ways because of labor issues. So it's much more expensive to hire someone at a market rate to work in the tech sector or to work in the US government unless they're highly mission driven, which is unfortunately not a large portion of the population of the tech sector. So for example, I have several family members working in the tech sector who have really remarkable expertise in this area, and I keep trying to urge them to move into public service because of the needs for their work. And frankly, it's just not financially tenable if they're trying to raise a family in a high cost area. And so this is a really big challenge in terms of establishing regulatory oversight. There's also the structure of the U.S. regulatory system, which by definition, on the executive level, functions in 4-year increments, or actually increasingly less than 4-year increments. A congressional landscape where it's very difficult to pass any legislation because of increased political polarization. And so as a result, we're seeing increased fragmentation in regulations where things happen where, for example, states start to pass laws. One of the things that was fascinating, we hosted at UVA one of the authors of Virginia's data privacy law, and one of the things that he highlighted was the fact that they have essentially no resources or people or time as part-time legislators to actually be able to come up with laws and policies in this area. But if they want to protect Virginians, the only option that they have is to hope that whatever advice that they get is sufficiently sophisticated and accurate, and then try to pass laws at the state level. So we're really seeing this reallocation of policymaking labor to places where it isn't necessarily best served. People at the state level don't have the same types of resources, and frankly, it also doesn't make as much sense for these systems of interstate commerce to be regulated by individual states. It also creates increased confusion, increased corporate costs. So one of the things that's been very interesting is while talking with people in the tech sector and the private sector, there's been definitely resistance to nationwide privacy legislation increasingly as there are more state laws and more state state requirements, there's actually been a softening of that perspective because it's becoming very expensive to try to meet different regulations. So, for example, Illinois has special biometric regulations. New York has special financial regulations, and then different U.S. states also have different private data privacy laws. So ultimately, the fragmented U.S. data regulation has enabled surveillance capitalism, this term that Shoshana Zuboff developed in 2019, this business model that's based on data collection. And because this has enriched a lot of companies, it's actually increasingly difficult to develop a system that pulls that back. And as new AI tools are being developed based on larger amounts of user data, as it becomes more feasible to process larger amounts of user data, it's increasingly difficult because there is much more value to gathering more about individuals. And one of the ways that I talk about this or think about it in my work is to think about data problems as we might think about climate problems, that there are huge financial incentives to maintain the status quo. But there are also huge social and financial issues related to long-term policies that are that operate in this vein. The other significant challenge is in order to explain concepts like data trafficking or to explain concepts like climate change, it requires a certain fundamental knowledge of how digital systems work, how large-scale large-scale data gathering functions and its potential implications, or in the climate context, how large-scale carbon emissions impact larger issues. But within a US context, a lot of policymaking occurs in, again, short-term increments, but also is focused on the needs of individuals rather than on the needs of the collective. So one of the most common conversations I have with people when I'm talking about this book is, what is my personal risk and how do I mitigate my personal risk personally by myself? And one of the huge challenges here is that this is really fundamentally a collective action issue. And it's very difficult to actually make any headway if individuals are just modifying their privacy settings. What it really requires is nationwide requirements for user data and protection, and even international protections. We haven't even gotten into that, but I'm happy to talk about it. In contrast, what we see in a Chinese context is where the Chinese government actually provides a huge amount of power and authority to government agencies to expansively monitor user data gathered by firms. And there are a huge number of laws and policies that are developed in this vein. I'll just talk about a couple of them, but I go into depth in the book. So, for example, China's cybersecurity law passed in 2017 requires all critical information infrastructure to be stored on Chinese servers. But critical information infrastructure broadly defined, Chinese servers broadly defined. The data security law requires all firms operating in China to submit their data gathering to a national security data audit, the process of which is very vague. And the ways in which I found out more about the national security data audit were just by talking with companies and investors who were very frustrated with the process. So I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that and what that looks like in the Q&A. And then things like the provisions for online internet governance, which create both civil and criminal penalties for producers, consumers, or distributors of content online that has negative national security implications, broadly spoken. So what this means is that essentially, and this applies internationally as well. So if I'm talking about China's international, or if I'm talking about, or especially if I'm talking online with Chinese colleagues about anything related to Chinese national security or something that is considered part of China's national security in 5 or 10 or 15 years, and that data is saved, then I could be subject to both civil and criminal penalties. So this is really expansive and really challenging. These laws apply not just to Chinese firms, but to international firms. The Hong Kong National Security Law also created increased extraterritorial implications for Chinese laws, where national security violations committed outside of Hong Kong also could be prosecuted in Hong Kong. Ironically, this also exists in parallel with an environment where Chinese users actually have a lot more protection from corporate data exploitation than users in the US do through things like the Personal Information Protection Law. So in many ways, the Personal Information Protection Law in China is much more in line with GDPR than it is with any US data protection policies. Now, obviously, this doesn't limit government access to user data, but it is really important to note that in some areas, China is much more in line with US allies and partners than the US is. And this is another policymaking challenge. So one of the things that we see in a Chinese context is these efforts to expand China's claims to cyber sovereignty, or this idea that all of China's digital resources belong to the state. And this includes things both domestically and internationally. And what this has led to is an environment of regulatory asymmetry, where anything that occurs within a Chinese context, a Chinese territorial context, is part of China's national sovereignty, as well as the actions of Chinese firms are also subject to Chinese government oversight. In contrast, we see an environment where it's very difficult for US firms to be able to move data from China to the US because of laws like the cybersecurity law, the data security law, the personal information protection law, etc. And so what we see is a fundamental conflict of interest in the tech sector, where firms, in order to be able to access the Chinese market, must comply with Chinese laws. But we really see very limited laws within a US context to protect user data. And even those laws really have minimal financial implications. So for example, when Facebook received a $5.7 million fine for violating children's data, which is really in some ways just a fee for doing business rather than any kind of significant financial implication for the firm. We have seen increased fees, but at this point, none of them are to the point where they would actually require significant changes in how businesses operate. This is why it's really important for there to be laws on the books that are more expansively applied, so that it's less random enforcement. This is actually also one of the challenges of using CFIUS, or the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US, to move forward with a lot of these issues. While CFIUS does a great job in their analysis, one of the challenges is that they don't have enough resources to address the entire US economy, for example. It can really only address things that have come to really significant, very obvious problems. But ultimately, what I argue in the book is that trade with China and the laws and policies required by the Chinese government for US firms to follow to enter the Chinese market actually amplifies the illiberalism of the US tech sector. So firms that are operating in China, US-based firms that are operating in China, ultimately have very little interest in disclosing what they're doing in the Chinese market, because it would create potential PR problems, as well as potential regulatory issues. So this just amplifies the kind of effort to maintain a black box algorithms, limited corporate transparency in these sectors. But ultimately, and this is where I'm doing focusing my new research, is that the U.S.-China tech relationship destabilizes global user data as firms across the world and countries across the world need to choose between largely US-based and Chinese-based tech platforms, both of which present significant challenges to national sovereignty in different ways. In the Chinese context, there's this very expansive vision of cyber sovereignty, which allows for expansive Chinese government claims. In the US context, there's an interesting there's an interesting analog, which is essentially never discussing the concept of cyber sovereignty or digital sovereignty or sovereignty as it relates to online spaces, which essentially gives firms totally free rein to move and gather data outside of the US because there's no acknowledgement of this idea of digital sovereignty. And so, in some ways, the approaches of the US and China are similar in their expansive claims to the data from other countries. And this was something that has been a huge issue in a lot of the research that I've conducted with colleagues in Japan and in Europe and in Korea. Ultimately, what I argue is that it's important to use the precautionary principle to mitigate data trafficking, meaning taking examples from Japan, Korea, India, the European Union to identify potential risks and then to leverage those, to leverage the perception of those risks into proactive policymaking. Now, obviously, for a lot of reasons, the US has not taken that approach. It's even difficult for the US to deploy risk-based decision-making at this point because of challenges that we see in Congress. But this is an ideal moving forward. So I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention. In the book, I offer additional case studies ranging from social media and gaming to health and biodata, consumer products, specifically baby monitors and security cameras. So you can purchase Data Trafficking wherever books are sold. And if you want some more information about the book, you can also check out my site at the Miller Center. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I welcome your questions.